Hi everyone, Elia here. This is a rather special episode because it's the first cross post between the Fire These Times and Resistance is Fertile. Resistance is Fertile is this podcast that I have recently launched with my good friend Carla Bergman on Star Trek, anarchism, the importance of political storytelling, and everything in between. We will do our best to, try and be as regular as we can, but ultimately we're doing this because it's fun and also because we feel like we need to. Longtime listeners of the Fire These Times may know by now that I consider myself a big Trekkie. I talk a lot about Star Trek when I can get away with it, and especially DS9 and TNG. And on this podcast with Carla, we will be talking about all of these things and more. I had Jessie on the Fire These Times before we actually launched Resistance is Fertile. But as Jessie Gender is best known on YouTube for her Star Trek videos, although she also does a bunch of other things as well, I decided for this episode to be cross-post instead, so that we introduce Resistance is Fertile to the Fire These Times listeners and vice versa. You will hear at the beginning of this episode especially me referencing a first episode. That's because Jessie was on the Fire These Times a few years ago. That's what that reference is. So while Resistance is Fertile is a podcast by the two of us, Carla and I, this episode is unique in the sense that it's just me this time around. This will not be a regular thing. It's really mostly just this one time. Carla and I will do all, if not at the very least, most of the podcast's episodes together. The topic of our conversation is the stories that fascism fears most. This is a topic that Carla and I will also be exploring a lot on Resistance is Fertile, hence why I decided to also put it here. Jessie will introduce herself at the beginning of the episode anyway, so the only thing that's left for me to do is to tell everyone that if you want to hear more podcasts on Star Trek and anarchism and sort of this radical side of science fiction and the political importance of storytelling, you can head over to patreon.com/resistanceisfertile. The Fire These Times, as those of you who know, is part of From the Periphery Media Collective. To support FTP, i.e. From the Periphery Media Collective, the best way to do so is also on Patreon at patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. As always, everyone, thank you for listening and take care.
They will resist us.
Resistance is futile.
Resistance is not futile.
Hi, I'm Elia ayoub,
Hey, I'm Carla Joy Bergman.
and you're listening to Resistance is Fertile, a podcast about Star Trek.
And a little bit of anarchy and a little bit of autonomy and a whole pile of fun. Yeah.
We get into DS9, TNG, Voyager, all stuff Star Trek for Trekkies and non-Trekkies. The intention is that we are going to convert you, and it will be a lot of fun. Hi, how are you, Jessie?
I'm doing good.
Introduce yourself to our listeners in case they haven't listened to the first episode, which they should, and if they haven't, they're not good people.
Yeah, they're terrible people. I'm judging you. I'm judging you from across the podcast feed. No, I'm a YouTuber. I do video essays on basically queer topics and also science fiction, nerddoms, pop culture, that sort of stuff. I'm a huge Trekkie. That's sort of the bread and butter, but I also talk about Star Wars. I talk about films generally, stuff like that. I also do news reviews and stuff like that on my secondary channel, and I'm a filmmaker. I believe since we last talked, my movie Identities came out, which is a science fiction film that stars John Delancey from Star Trek The Next Generation, Abigail Thorne, who many people may know from PhilosophyTube if you're a YouTube person, but also has been in Star Wars The Acolyte, also been in House of the Dragon, and numerous other folks as well. That's on Nebula. Yeah, so I'm very, very proud of that. That was recently a honoree at the 2025 Webby Awards, so that's been
Congrats.
Yeah, it's been very cool.
Amazing.
And yeah, I'm directing an episode for Nebula's series coming up that we're filming this summer. I'm not sure when the release date is, but it's called Subliminal. So yeah, it's been doing pretty good. And then I have a book coming out hopefully sometime next year that is basically a queer history of Star Trek. So
That's amazing. Okay, well, I'm gonna have you third time on then.
yeah. I'm in the thick of
Amazing.
writing it right now, so we'll see exactly when the release date ends up being. But it's been fun. It's been nice.
I am definitely looking forward to that one. Jessie, for those who don't know, and I actually don't know if I told you this, but you are the one who got me into DS9,
Ah,
which is
good. good.
which is to this day still my favorite Star Trek. I know you said I need to. Last time actually you said this. I need to watch Lower Decks, and I still haven't done so. I will do it at some point.
Lower Decks is my second favorite.
I know. But I'm actually rewatching Star Trek because I'm gonna start doing a podcast at some point with my friend Carla Bergman on all things Star Trek, and we both are rewatching
Nice.
DS9 at the same time.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's I love Deep Space Nine. Like the book I just mentioned, the whole sort of conceit of it is just arguing that the first half of the book is basically arguing like Star Trek is this kind of push and pull between wanting to imagine a better future, but then someone's being pulled back to the present. And then the sort of
Hmm.
turn in the book is when I get to Deep Space Nine, where I talk about Deep Space Nine being sort of a queer centering of the
Yeah,
future in the sense that
yeah,
like it's a people who are ostracized and marginalized. So it's such a wonderful series. Like Star Trek I love generally, but Deep Space Nine I think just captures everything I love about Star Trek.
I
So
completely agree, and that's why like the podcast is gonna be called "Resistance is Fertile," as in not futile, of
yeah.
course. And yeah,
Oh, I
we're
like
gonna do a
that. That's
lot of
awesome.
DS9. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're very proud of the pun. So the video essay.
Hmm.
The stories fascism fears most. I've noticed that you've been doing quite a few episodes or quite a few videos rather on storytelling, on the importance of
Hmm.
storytelling, which is of
Hmm.
course, I mean, a lot of tricky stuff anyway. How would you describe the moment that led you to making this specific video, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, the reason that I made this video was kind of frustration out of the election here in the United States, Trump getting elected. And, the video itself is kind of evolution of a Star Wars video that I did a few months ago, which was talking about how Star Wars is this sort of American monomyth.
Yeah.
Sort of like the Joseph Campbell, like here's the story of America, and how Joseph Campbell has how a lot of our storytelling in Hollywood, especially, sort of centers on this sort of monomythical framing. Even if you sometimes break it and they sometimes change the rules a little bit, they still all center around this like hero who goes out, returns, and it centers this very individualistic understanding of our history, as
Hmm.
well as in Star Wars, this very much this push and pull between fascism and neoliberal style democracy, and this constant critique of like individuals get to decide for us whether we fall to fascism or whether we fall to neoliberal style democracy, and then everyone else sort of gets othered around that. So Star Wars constantly others, Asian cultures, Jewish people, like pick your group, and they've otherized them, indigenous cultures in positive and negative ways, but in a way that sort of constantly centers that. And I made that Star Wars video, and it was sort of talking about that and wanting to discuss stuff like Star Wars Andor. A video I wanted to do after it was like discussing Star Wars Andor and a couple other things that have done within the Star Wars franchise, sort of pushed towards more collectivist storytelling of like how do we resist, how do we create new futures, how do we build new ideas of the world. And then on top of that, I did a recent video also called The Dreaming of a Queer Internet, which is a video I'm really proud of, which was about how the internet has been this place that used to be this queer frontier where people found themselves, were able to articulate identities beyond, like, build a digital self that was kind of in some ways truer to who they actually wanted to be than they were, and then how it's slowly been corporatized over time, as we've seen. And I use sort of film history to sort of discuss that. David Cronenberg and Ready Player One and one of my favorite movies of all time, Hackers, movies like that, The Matrix. And so looking at those two things and then seeing the election happen and just getting very frustrated at people not understanding that a lot of why Trump won, in my opinion, is the story he's telling. And the story he's telling is one that is relying on this monomythical framing of America, one that leans into fascism because there's been this push for understanding the more collectivist understanding of the United States, more understanding that there's not necessarily one, this sort of postmodern view of the world of like there's not one overriding myth. There is people getting different cultures, different stories, and they all tell their own stories that make us more diverse and more inclusive because we are stronger by understanding that humanity is many different things. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. And so, fascism trying to pull back into this very modernist perspective of like there's one overriding story, one overriding myth, and we need to use violence, whether rhetorical violence, physical violence, institutional violence, to reassert the story that we've been telling. Because all of the story that we've been telling is always ingrained in a lot of the assumptions that we make. Whether it be the hero is generally white, cisgender, straight, We have a very heterosexual culture that sort of ingrains cis heteronormativity, all of these things. So the video kind of came out, and it's a two-part video. The first video was sort of a reiteration of the Star Wars video, just without necessarily overly focusing on Star Wars. And then the second video was being like, okay, it was taking what I was going to do with that Star Wars Andor video and just extrapolating it out further, and being like, here are stories that are trying to tell a new version of the story and trying to tell a new way of how we can think about these things. And I centered queer stories first, queer and trans stories, mainly, because that's the story that I know, and that's how I that's how I enter into this more collectivist thinking. Because that's kind of what I wanted to replicate in the thing is like there's many different stories, but ultimately what it leads to is we need to have solidarity with each other, connect up with other people, and we can create these linking ideas. But we have to do it through understanding, that everyone has their own stories and differences that they're going to be telling. And so I found that by being like, I'm trans. That's what got me to escape the monomythical storytelling that America has. And then from there, I started to link up and understand other stories from there. The video is basically kind of running through that as a concept, just sort of guiding people through my journey without overtly stating that, but basically journeying them along the same journey that I have. But then also at the same time, people don't understand that still, and how a lot of our media literacy in a lot of stories with media today, people keep trying to pull the stories back to the monomyth and keep trying to frame it in their conceptualization of the world that sort of centers sort of America constantly in the conversation. And how my end basic point is like, here's the journey I laid out for you, but I also told you how everyone, like at every single point of the way, people misinterpret it. And so how do we go forward? And the way to go forward is to stop constantly going back and trying to explain to these people over and over and over again. And it's not necessarily trying to be antagonistic to them, but we spend so much of our time being like, oh, look, this person said some ridiculous fucking thing about trans people today, and now we need to just waste our time responding to that. It's like if we end up doing that, we constantly center them. We constantly center that noise. And it's like we need, from just a storytelling perspective, I'm bored of that. I'm bored of it. I want new stories. I want to hear new things. I want to be engaged intellectually and emotionally. And then in terms of political movements, we need to start thinking of how we collectivize and how we connect with people. Because I feel like one of the biggest problems that faces us today is how we atomize ourselves and we segment off ourselves, especially on the internet. It has become very much, I don't want to say impossible, but very difficult to have any conversation about our own individual feelings and needs, because ultimately then it ends up getting thrown into an antagonistic conversation. It's like, oh, you're talking about trans women. Why are you not talking about this? Why are you not talking about this? And it's like, I'm not necessarily trying to override that, but we can't all talk about these things. We need to talk about these things in unison, but not necessarily that they're the same exact thing. And I think we're all trained to sort of be like, everything needs to be everything for everybody, because our culture has told us to consume everything for, like, everything needs to be consumable by everybody. And it needs to be, no, we need to understand each other, be empathetic towards each other, come to learn from each other, but understand we need to be having conversations across differences, not necessarily trying to create one overriding myth that we all need to sort of shove ourselves into. That's the short version of the video.
What you were saying kind of made me think of, I think it was the first compilation of solar punk stories. It was published in Portuguese in Brazil like years ago. And the editor, and I had quoted him in an article I wrote for New Lines a few years ago. And he said, like, why did he choose solar punk? He said, like, because Brazil's fantastic literature biosphere was already, quote unquote, polluted with coal and petroleum. So the way he kind of thought was explaining it is that it's not that there aren't good stories, for example, that were cyberpunk, because he was asked, like, why not do cyberpunk? Because, that's what has been dominating the future in terms of the stories we were telling. And he's like, it's not that there aren't good stories that are cyberpunk, it's just there are so many stories that are cyberpunk and just not enough of other things. And so that's how he got into solarpunk effectively. Because I reached the same conclusion that you did on and off for a while now. What got me into solarpunk, for example, in terms of just thinking about it, and Star Trek for that matter, it's just that I got really tired and even bored of so many of the post-apocalyptic movies and series. Again, some of which are good storytelling, in terms of just the infrastructure of it all is well done. But there's just so many, I got saturated. It just got saturated in my mind. It's like I got it. The future is bad. Things are gonna get bad. And if you're in some movies like the I Am Legend one, there's like one guy who's gonna save everything. Again, going back to that hero arc and whatnot. And I just got genuinely really, really tired of it. It's
Yeah.
around that time that I got into more and more into Star Trek as well. Hence, whereas the DS9 was kind of very refreshing, of course, in compared to all of that. I didn't even get to it by rejecting, for example, cyberpunk or dystopian
Yeah.
fiction or any of that. It's just I think it's just too much of it, and just not enough of everything else.
And I love cyberpunk fiction. It's like one of my favorite
Mm.
genres, but I agree because it's especially like a lot of dystopian fiction sort of ends up either, let me put it this way, there with cyberpunk stories, the general idea tends to be like, oh, look at capitalism gone amok and it's like
Yeah.
gone too far, and there's still queer people within that of like trying to find their own identity, trying to find themselves within this future, whether it be through technology, whether it be through augmenting themselves, whether it be through the internet or some form of the internet, like the metaverse or whatever. So like those stories are often very queer in ethos. When I say queer, I don't necessarily mean like gay, straight, bisexual, transgender, though that can be that. It's more like people who are marginalized trying to find their own identity within a culture that is telling them to subsume themselves to the dominant culture. So like that's why I love cyberpunk stories, but it is one that is just our present day extended out and not necessarily thinking of new things. And then post-apocalyptic fiction often too, that I also really like I Am Legend and stuff like that. It's often still sort of doing the Walking Dead sort of thing of like, oh, the human beings are the Walking Dead and we're really just evil and we're always going to be atomizing ourselves and like me versus you. And it centers this idea that we have in our culture today, in America especially, which is very individualistic. And so once society falls, everyone's just going to be out for themselves. And that's an extension of the presumptions of our modern day culture. And it falls into, not saying that these stories are fascist, but it falls into that sort of rhetoric that fascism relies upon, that same
Yeah.
logic that fascism
Yeah.
relies upon, which says we need to hold on to the status quo, hold on desperately to the way the institutions and the way things are, because if we don't, then everything will fall apart and it'll all be chaos. So we need to vilify the queer people. We need to vilify, people who are the DEI, like people who are ruining the fabric of our society, because if we ruin the fabric of our society, then everything goes to shit. And whether that be like because God said so, or because the apocalypse will happen, or because Western society will fall, whatever argument that they make, and usually a combination of all of it, it's usually them reaffirming the status quo, which is why I like stories like Star Trek or Solar Punk, because it gets into this idea that I've been really gravitating towards. I think the best articulation I've seen is in a philosopher named Jose Esteban Munoz, who's a queer philosopher who I really, really love, who I quote in the video briefly.
Yeah.
But his whole thing is that queerness is about, when you are queer, you're always reaching for a horizon, like a utopian horizon, in a future where we are not seen as queer. But we are always reaching for it. But when we form queer communities, and again, I'm not saying queer in terms of sexuality, when we form queer communities, we're forming a microcosm of that future between ourselves. And then we build that future out. And that can connect very easily to, in terms of political rhetoric, to consciousness raising with like workers' rights, like workers' unions. They're building that future themselves of something new, something different. We're always aiming for a better future on the horizon. And so I've been looking more and more for stories that reflect that. And Star Trek is such an interesting one I always come back to, because Star Trek, especially outside Deep Space Nine, is this interesting thing of like, it is a better future, but it also and sometimes reflects the assumptions of our modern day, like the white hero captain, generally the sort of like extension of American liberalist philosophies extended out. But sometimes it's that tension with that, because it also has a collectivist future. It has a future that is trying to respect diversity of thought and ideas. So it's this interesting tension that Deep Space Nine as a show, and I bring this up in the video, kind of perfectly encapsulates, because it says, here's those ideals, here's how the institutions of those futures fail those ideals, but here's the people living in that future, the queer weirdos on the outskirts of the Star Trek society that actually still live up to them. So that's why I like Star Trek, because it's this weird, like, hopeful and yet critique of institutional present. Anyways, that's just kind of the stories that I've been gravitating towards, like stories that are about people building a better future based on like a new way of thinking about the world, because we can't keep relying on our present status quo. We need to think of new status quos, and we need stories to help us think about what that's going to be.
So there's this concept of elite panic. And essentially, for listeners who don't may not know, the stories that dominate what we tend to consume, what tends to be in many movies, many series, many books, and so on, the post-apocalyptic ones, to name maybe one of the obvious ones, tends to reflect a certain worldview, as you just said. That's a worldview that, for example, I think of, I don't know, Peter Thiel thinking that he can just have a bunker in New Zealand, right? Or like, what's his face, Zuckerberg buying an island in Hawaii or
Yeah,
stuff like
Hawaii.
that.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally they believe that that's all they need, right? Or rather that this is how they would be safe and whatnot. And what I find kind of interesting, or in a maybe in a fucked up way, but like fascinating about that kind of conceptualization of what they think the future could look like, is that they imagine, I would imagine that they do, that there is such a thing as a self-sustaining bunker, for example, or there is such a thing as like I just need my island, I just need my mountaintop, I just need my own bunker, whatever it might be, and I don't need the rest of society. I don't need humans. I don't need whatnot. That's just not how most people experience the world, and yet that's disproportionately the stories we tend to hear because it reflects a certain vision that usually people who are already in certain positions of
Power.
influence and power already believe. Whereas if I think of how do people in most situations of disasters actually react, actually act, and we have case studies, this is not just theoretical. Rebecca Solnit's book comes to mind, We Built a Paradise Out of Hell or something like that, in which she talks about Hurricane Katrina, for example, which was one of the big case studies in which people actually came together. And there was a lot of mutual aid and people were just helping one another and whatnot. And yet a certain retelling of Hurricane Katrina as an example, which you can still see if you go like on, which I've done a few times, like on the web archives and so on, like how was the media reporting on it? It was all about
Looting. It was all
looting, exactly. And like 99% of the time just purely imagined, and there were these white militias who were like defending their neighborhoods against no one, stuff like that. And that tells me obviously, which is relevant to what we're talking about, that like so there are stories. There are stories that are replicated or propagated in our media, in our culture, and so on. And while a lot of it is like American, it's impossible at this point. Like I'm not even I've been to the US like briefly once, and I'm Lebanese, born and raised there, and so on. It's also global because of the export of the US
because
to various extents.
America and Western culture generally just sort of exporting these concepts. Yeah.
And that, of course, then well, the way it's adapted into different contexts, that's like an interesting conversation in and of itself. But for the most part, it also projects a certain vision of the world. And my kind of the thing that really still to this day really bothers me or bugs me or whatever, and I'm still trying to think about it a lot, is this concept of realism. And for listeners who have already heard me talk about this 1,000 times, I apologize, but I'll do it one more time here. There is this concept of, for example, capitalist realism, and by Mark Fisher. And so essentially, like my probably bad way of explaining it on the spot is even those of us who, for the most part, who, for example, call us as anti-capitalist, or who don't believe that capitalism is a good system, or whatever, for the most part, we're still limited in our vision, in our horizon, by capitalism. It's very difficult to quite literally imagine a world that does not include this thing called capitalism.
As the phrase goes, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Yep.
Exactly. And of course, then there is Ursula Le Guin basically saying that we live in and you have that scene. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine rights of kings. When I think of people who, I don't know if this is in your video, or I definitely have seen it somewhere, but one of Ben Shapiro's, he has a sticker on his laptop and it says like, facts don't care about your feelings. And there's so many implications with that, right? It implies so much. It says that, of course, he doesn't have these feelings, things that other people are constrained by. He's above it all. That there is such a thing as just pure facts, especially in social context. I'm not talking about gravity, but like in terms of like the gender binary or whatever, as of course that's what he would use. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it goes to what they argue, like him and Matt Walsh's and really conservatives, and like there's an overriding quote unquote truth. Like if you listen to a lot of their talks, like Matt Walsh was sort of the most overt one about this because he was always talking about truth, but it's ingrained in pretty much all of their thinking is that there's some overriding truth to the world that, queer people or people of color or something else are getting wrong, or more often than not actively lying about to try to trick you into falling into their trap. And the truth of the truth is usually generally relying on people's quote unquote common sense, as they will say, but but the common sense that they have been taught is exactly that, what they've been taught based on culture. Like there are only two sexes, that biology determines your path in life, and that biology is binary. Things like, I mean, I use that as the closest example because I'm trans, and so that's the one I sort of can overtly reach for. But even like the sort of white status quo, sort of very centrally on white, on heterosexuality, on all of these things. And so it's just like, oh, the common sense that people have, quote unquote, is based on what they've been culturally taught. And so, and to go back to the point that we were talking about with the video and that you were making, is that, you know, the quote unquote left, if I may use the left as sort of a larger term, we've been good at articulating why thing bad.
Yeah.
But when we constantly center on like this thing is bad, we're still centering that as the overriding discussion. So you're just offering people like, okay, I get capitalism's bad, or I get conservatism's bad, or I get I get these things are bad, but what do I do? And one thing I just constantly keep seeing over and over again is this people being like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I don't know what to go forward with. Because we have been so isolated by the internet, and COVID sort of accelerated the isolationism that we have. People just sort of reach for what's easy. And like I was having this conversation the other day with my friend, and she's like, yeah, people like are just going mad because like they're so isolated, they don't have community. And it just speaks to that. And that's why we sort of people get sort of sucked into these ecosystems of regurgitating these horrific things, because they don't have any interaction with people outside of themselves. It's very much what I was trying to do with the video, because I'm focused on pop culture, right? Like I try to be an educator and an activist for trans rights and everything, but like I grew up doing film and talking about film, so it's like I'm not necessarily a political organizer. So what I can talk about is be like, these are the stories we need to be thinking about more. And what I always try to put it is like, stories are never going to be, I don't want to ever get like, there tends to be some writers who be like, stories can change the world, and they cause it. It's like, no, what I think stories are important to do is they start to get people to think about new ways they think about the world, start to dream of new ways of thinking about it. And when you can dream of these things, then people can then start to articulate and make them actionable and say, I want to reach for that. I want to build the Star Trek world or this solar punk world. And then once I can articulate that, then there can be some sort of consciousness raising and organization around that. So I am someone who's like, I don't think, I want to make stories. I want to make film. I want to make TV. Like my hope with the things that I make is to get people to think of the world in a new way. But I never think that that's going to be the spur for change. I think it's going to be the thing that gets people to think about what we can change and what we can build. And I think we're just at a place where we don't even have that. And I think that's the foundation that we need to be building more of, like starting to articulate to people, what are the worlds we can build? We need new stories. And it's why I see, and this is the last point I'll make. I know I'm ranting here, but this is why I've also done videos on like machine learning algorithms taking over Hollywood and the AI, because with AI storytelling, why they do that. I mean, it's capitalism. They want to make everything cheaper. But what the effect of that will be is that it will just continually, AI cannot create anything new. So all it's going to do is continually replicate an increasingly more error-prone, decaying effect, is just tell the same story and over again. All these capitalist sort of stories that we've been regurgitating, Western cultural stories that we've been discussing here, and not thinking of anything new. And that's why I rally against that stuff, because it's like, we need to be thinking of new stories, and all of these factors that we see coming in of people not having time to write new stories. So they just write what they know. Like people are just so like you look at Hollywood, a lot of my writer friends, they don't have time to write new stories because they're just like, oh, we have like a week to write an episode. I'm going to just regurgitate what I can as fast as I can. People not living a life as much. So they just rely on stories that they know. AI just replicating stories over and over again. Like they're just, it's harder and harder to tell these stories, because we're not able to see it. And as that, to me, the future dims more and more by the fact that we don't think of more stories. And I think I'm not like trying to get doomeristic about it. I think there are plenty of stories and plenty of people writing them, but it comes from, I think, the marginalized groups, like queer people, people of color, different places. It's kind of what I was getting at the end of that video, which is like, hey, like, because I explained like, here's the trans story, it's in Star Wars, Star Trek, here's some other ones. But then I pointed out like, Octavia Butler's been saying this. Indigenous communities have been writing this. Like Arab communities, Arab fantasy has been doing this. Like people have this stuff exists, and it's been here. We just not been focusing on or centering it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what we were talking, I
Sorry,
realized.
I ranted for a while there.
No,
Apologies.
no, no, no. This is perfect. I took some notes because I wanted to make sure I don't forget anything, which I probably will anyway, but it's okay. So I had you on in 2023, and it was actually a few months before I finished the PhD at the time, which was on Lebanese cinema. I'll get into it in another episode more, but like the long story short is that so there was a civil war in Lebanon between 75 and 1990. And the movies I focused are the post-war movies, so 90s onwards. I wrote this very long doctorate, like 400 pages or so, like insanely annexed and citations. Like it was it tires me even thinking about how long it took to finish it. But by the end of it, I realized that like okay, I had seen probably most films that were released since the 90s. It's not a huge industry, so it's actually feasible to do. And there are these underlying themes, these themes that were repeating and whatnot. Usually, it's like have we healed from the war? These hauntings from the wars. There's a lot of metaphors of hauntings and whatnot. So I play with that quite a lot in the doctorate. But are there movies or films or even short films? Imagine us moving beyond that, beyond post-war, beyond the war. And there are a few, but very, very few of them. And what I realized later on is actually that this was the kind of for those who may not know how I got there, but that's a bit of my bridge towards like solar punk and Star Trek and other stuff like that, is that I was really looking for something that, like in DS9, as you explore in the video, it's not about erasing the past or pretending like the trauma isn't there or the war crimes like between what the Cardassians did to the Bajorans and in DS9 and so on. Like it's not about pretending that none of that is there, but it's acknowledging that it's there, acknowledging that this is what happened, what just happened in the case of DS9 and so on. And also, okay, what do we do with that information? How can we move on? Not move on in the sense of forgetting or erasing, but quite literally, like how do we heal effectively?
Yeah, yeah. That's why I love Deep Space Nine so much because it is about that, right?
Yeah,
It's about
exactly.
like
Exactly.
all the other Star Treks are these characters who got born into that future unscathed, right? Like Picard, like they will encounter traumas throughout the story, but like they get to exist in that future relatively unscathed. And are like the heroes, the heroes of those stories.
Yeah.
But in Deep Space Nine, you get this man from the very first episode who has been traumatized by the Borg, which is like literally portrayed as the Captain Picard, the captain of the Enterprise, who was
Yeah.
the Borg at that. So like the hero of that story traumatized him, and it's not incidental that he's a black man. And there's so many episodes of that series that interrogate what it means for this black man to be this hero of this very American franchise and what that's meaning. And there's a really wonderful scene in one of the later seasons of the show that I love, where like all the characters are doing this like heist in Vegas in the holodeck, and it's like a Vegas heist episode. And it's like for fun, and everyone's sort of taking part and like, ooh, I'm gonna be, this person. And then Cisco kind of is not wanting to get involved, and he has this great discussion where he says, I have a problem with having a story set in Vegas where like I as a black man at that time would not have been allowed in. So how can I go and have fun and have a good time? And it's kind of him talking about Star Trek. He's not just talking about Vegas, and he's talking about Star Trek. He's talking about like, oh, how do I as a black man get to sit in this pretend future where everything's great and everything's wonderful and not acknowledge that pain that exists here? And the show is constantly bringing up that theme of like this pain exists, that we see it with the fascism that the Bajorans, which are these indigenous group that dealt with a fascist and settler colonialist invasion of their homeworld and are now healing from it. It's constantly being like, how do we build a better future from that pain? And Jose Esteban Munoz, who I quote, who I really love, he has this great mention of glance to the past. Like we queer people are always focusing on the horizon, trying to escape our constant present, which the constant present is sort of the representation of the status quo that we're always trapped in, and we glance to the past. And it's why I love queerness as a overriding discussion, because it centers not the non-linearity of time in people who are marginalized. Queer people have to understand that like we are stuck in a present and we are seen as queer and ostracized and different. We also have to spend this time with re-understanding our own personal past of like we had to come to understand that we are queer, so we have to understand that trauma and like understand that our puberties, our growing ups are going to be different, especially trans people are like we literally have different puberties. But then we also learn that our history is often erased and destroyed, as many marginalized peoples do, and having to re-find it. So our understanding of our past is constantly being interrogated. and yet we're also reaching for a future at the same time that is something better. So we're marginalized people, and again, queerness is just a great metaphor for it, is in a constant nonlinear negotiation with past, present, and future. And it's about sort of like negotiating the traumas of our own personal history, our communal history, refining our communal history trauma, because a lot of it's been erased, regardless of what marginalized community you're in, through colonization and such. And then trying to build a better future while constantly in negotiation with all of these things. That's why I love Deep Space Nine so much, because it is a show quite literally about representing the nonlinearity of all of that and the healing of all of that.
I remember specifically that episode where when he mentioned the heist that you mentioned, where he says like I can only go back far enough, basically. Because it reminded me, of course, of Octavia Butler's book Kindred, where for those who don't know, and you talk about Octavia in the video as well. I'm gonna be bad at explaining it, but like there's a black woman, she's dating this white guy in modern New York or somewhere.
Modern at the time of the book, so yeah.
Yeah, modern of the book.
So it's moved into suburbia.
Something happens. Don't spoil it too much. But then she is actually brought back in time to slavery, but she's also forced back into the future, or i.e. the present, time and time again. And there's a lot of politics of temporality which I would like to explore one day. But what was kind of very, very marking and extremely powerful about that book is that you really realize that, like, yeah, I mean, they can only go so far. And the fact that it's recognized, it's even acknowledged that he says so out loud, like, for me, that was so powerful, because what I've gotten used to, and mostly films and series that have been released since DS9 for that matter, is actually trying to retell the past by, and I'm not saying this cannot be done in an interesting way. I don't wanna kind of shit on it entirely, but like, it can be done in a very problematic way. Of like, just for example, like, you have Marie Antoinette, and her second in command is a black man for some reason. Like it's reintroducing our, maybe let's say, modern desires for diversity and whatnot, and putting that onto the past.
Bridgerton.
Exactly, Bridgerton, yeah, the TV series. And so it's stuff like that for me. Again, I'm not saying it cannot be done in interesting ways, and what I'm not like an expert, but I've seen it often enough used in a way that's just there to make the past look less problematic, less horrible in many cases than it actually was. And kind of the flip side of that, and the reason why it's for me so important to even emphasize that this is about storytelling first and foremost, is that, for example, when I think of that cartoon, the Jetsons, which was released in the 60s, it's very much like a future that's like, what, I think 2060 or something. It's when it was implied or set or something. Something like that. I remember thinking that we're roughly like where our current time is roughly halfway through, something along those lines. So it might be something like that. And what's of course interesting about the Jets, and you can just watch the trailers for those who don't know, you know what I'm talking about, is that you have this futuristic, there's a robot, flying cars and whatever, but then gender norms are just white American suburbia of the 1950s, and they assume that the future would be like that as well, because that's what it was when they were, when they were imagining it.
He still goes to work for a boss who's kind of a dick.
Yes.
He's still middle class. He still has a robot who is a clearly like, arguably, if it's directly black coded, but clearly marginalized coded, of like, look at the slave labor we have, so it's just a replication of the present with bigger technology, right?
And so for me, what's interesting is that, okay, I think now when I watch bits of that, I think, okay, well, clearly they got this all wrong, right? Because that's not what the future is going to look like, because that's not what the present is, even like today. And I just extrapolate from that, and I ask myself, okay, well then, what are some of the stories that are being told today in the present day about the future that are kind of making the same mistake? The same assumptions, the same, again, this realism limitations of the horizon. So I was thinking a bit about that, because even in some of the Lebanese films that I mentioned, like I was studying, there's only one that comes to mind that tried to imagine the future. And it's the long story short is it's a documentary about the actual space program that happened in Lebanon in the 1960s by one university. And the documentary is fascinating. It's called the Lebanese Rocket Society. It's a very fascinating documentary.
What's it called?
Lebanese Rocket Society. Easy to remember. And that was the name of the club, or the society rather. It was by Haigazian University, which is the Armenian university in Beirut, and so on. So the story is fascinating. And then towards the end, or rather the final scene, a different director is brought in to do this experimental thing where he tries to imagine, well, what would have Lebanon looked like had the space program continued? basically, rather than been stopped in the 60s. And it was stopped for geopolitical reasons. The long story short, the Americans and Israelis were not happy about it, so it stopped. That's kind of the long story short.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. But so he imagines this future of like I'm gonna say the 2030s, 2040s or whatever, or rather he imagined what today would have looked like if it had been that future instead. The phenomenon is called retrofuturism. The problem with how it was done is that it more or less imagined Lebanon as being basically what a certain vision of America is, effectively. Like America
Yeah.
did do the space program, did do the go on to the moon and all of that, and that's what followed. It was very much a very actually like a deterministic timeline, effectively. Like had we
Yeah.
succeeded in the space stuff, we would have modernized in this very specific, almost like scripted way, basically. What it reminded me of is just the critique that you had of Picard, actually. They actually tried to go back into the past, a bit of fan service, whatever, but it got staled in the end. Like it felt like it
Yeah.
didn't go where it could have
Picard
gone,
season
basically.
3 was basically them doing Next Generation again, but in the future. So
Exactly.
it's like, oh, we can only replicate these things, and then the characters, even most of the characters were like the next generation. Like the best way I could describe it is the finale of the series finale of Picard season 3 was called The Last Generation, right? It was
Right.
called it's this fear of the future. And
Yeah.
all of the next generation characters they have, like Picard has a kid in that season, Geordi has a kid in that season.
Yeah.
They just fit the same roles as their parents,
Yeah.
essentially. And so it's just, oh, we're constantly replicating the present just with younger people coming in. And just going back to your point about the Lebanese Rocket Society sort of replicating the American version of the space program. I hate to keep bringing it back to Star Trek, but I think this is why I'm so fascinated by Star Trek, because it's such an interesting example of the underlying assumptions of so much of American society and
Yeah.
Western culture
Yeah.
to a large
Yeah.
degree. One of the constant things you see coming up in Star Trek, especially in the original series and Next Generation, is this assumption of a linear path towards progress. Like even the phrase, because they have this idea of the Prime Directive that we can't interfere with societies unless they like get warp, and there's a phrase that they say is pre-warp civilizations,
Yes,
which has
exactly.
the underwriting assumption that warp is deterministic, that all cultures will eventually follow the same path to reach warp drive, and that's the point where they are mature enough to then interact with the rest of society. And until that point, they are quote unquote primitive, until they have reached this certain bar of technological development that mirrors Western culture's development, is as depicted in like the Star Trek sort of presumed future. There's multiple ways, like that's an underlying assumption that's very obvious, but it's thrown throughout the series of this sense of like a predetermined linear path of progress that everyone's eventually going to align up on, and it mirrors Western culture. And how much respect we have for a civilization is how much they mirror human development, which human means American. So it's this constant sort of Western cultural thing that it seems, again, I don't want to speak necessarily because I don't know Lebanese film, but like it sounds like that idea is seeped in there, where it's sort of like Western culture sort of overrides this, creates this idea of like, oh, everyone's got to have to be like us. And it's the same thing going back to that Joseph Campbell monomyth that I was saying. Joseph Campbell essentially argued his argument of the monomyth was that there is one central myth in all of human culture that every other culture has found that he can slot them into. And what a surprise, the best version of the monomyth was found by Western people. Look, the white people figured it out and did it best, and everyone else has versions of it, but ours is the best one. And all, like, even like the one of the more obvious ones is he was talked about Jewish people, and like Jewish folks, he would argue like Jewish people didn't understand their own myths and had to like, they need to be corrected and fixed. It's like they don't understand their own myths as well as non-Jewish people do. They don't understand their own myths, but he did it for like everyone, indigenous cultures, Middle Eastern culture, everyone. And so it's this idea that like, oh, everyone will eventually return to the mean, which is what white people want and what Western culture wants, and it's that presumption that then they try to propagandize out.
Yeah, and that's why it's not like when they kind of try and subvert that is usually often like the more interesting episodes, I would say.
Exactly. That's when Star Trek pushes against that, it subverts that, it goes against it. And it's
Yeah.
also why you see this push in modern culture like against like woke DEI in television and movies. It's not just in Star Trek, but it's like Star Wars and all essential big monocultural products that have like been made in Hollywood, like Star Wars, Star Trek, whatever, Marvel, where it's like, oh, if we start to put more marginalized people in those stories, we need to vilify them because they're either A, not showing the perspective that we want, or more often than not, B, you're just sticking a woman into the slot that is made for a man. That it's still, they're still telling that same monomyth, but like we center men in masculinity and white dudes, cis dudes, straight dudes in our culture. So seeing someone else in that role, it gets people angry because this is the story made for the dominant people on the hierarchy.
There is a film, though, or there are a series of film franchise, The Matrix. The way they're talked about, I realized this in myself. Like while watching your video, I had realized that it's been so long since I've actually seen The Matrix, the first one I'm talking about, that I forgot that it's not about. 'Cause so I do a lot of research on the far right and conspiracy stuff and all of that stuff. And so I've listened to a lot of podcasts, read papers and whatnot of, Andrew Tate talking about the Matrix and, taking the red pill, QAnon, all of that stuff. That I actually forgot that there is actually a movie called The Matrix with like two directors who are, of course, trans women, and the metaphor, or it's an allegory about being trans and all of that stuff. And when I watched your video essay, it took me back to like this original point of the movie, effectively, that even myself as someone, and to go back to that the editor of the Solarpunk book, who says like, basically my imaginary was colonized or was polluted by these other associations, where I had this moment where like I just paused. I remember actually even pausing the video, just realizing that there is actually this movie that I enjoyed. I really genuinely enjoyed this film. It's an amazingly done, amazingly well made film. But it was just used so often in such a completely decontextualized manner. And even the fact that the directors themselves have said this is what the movie is about, the way it is being talked about. There was a recent interview with I forgot the name, Lily, I think. Is that the name?
Lily and Lana Wachowski. Yep.
Yeah, it was Lily. There was a recent interview like 2 weeks ago and so on. We're recording this and end of April 2025, and she even like said like the Nazi in the White House, Elon Musk. This is like her terms, has used the Matrix for this and this and that. And I was like, if the people who created the thing, they're saying this is what the thing is about, and yet the thing has also then been used in this completely different way, isn't that a good argument that ultimately we are ruled by stories? Like people are telling themselves a story about this film that if they quote unquote, if facts don't care about one's feelings, quote unquote, it would at least matter what the directors who made it said that it was about. And yet it doesn't. What the actual directors say the Matrix franchise is about hasn't seeped into how has become dominant at the very least. Yeah.
Well, I think it speaks to, this is me saying this as someone who loves the Matrix. I adore the Matrix a ton, but it speaks to the failures of the original movie that the most recent one, Matrix Resurrections, was trying to rectify, which is, the original movie ultimately was trying to argue that like Neo is the one, right? Oh, Neo is the one who can save us all. But the implication of the original movie is that Neo is not actually the one. It is his relationship with others, and most specifically with Trinity, his love for Trinity and care for Trinity, that lets him be the one. Like the end of the movie is like they kiss, and then he's able to get powers at that point. And it is specifically his relationship with other people and his coming together with other people and building that community that allows him to gain that power and to be stronger. But the failure of that movie is, it makes that sort of like metaphorical and not necessarily explicit. So you can still read him as like, oh, he's the powerful, strong dude who gets the girl. And it's not necessarily the girl who like the collective part. It's like, oh, dude who gets the girl saves the day. And he becomes strong because he gets the girl, that very individualistic, monomythical concept that then can be easily co-opted by people like Andrew Tate, who essentially what they're arguing is like, don't beat the Matrix. You can't beat the Matrix. The Matrix is strong. You just need to be the winner of the Matrix. And they'll frame it as like, I'm Morpheus, you need to destroy the Matrix and everything, but they're not really arguing for you to upend our status quo. They're just saying to be the most dominant person and be the best at winning the game. Like, be the best at dominating women, dominating capitalism, like just win the game and you'll become the one. And so what Matrix Resurrections, and the other two Matrix movies try to do this as well, but I think Matrix Resurrections is most overtly trying to engage with this, is that's a movie that's engaging with how capitalism took the Matrix, sold it as a product, and stripped a lot of the meaning from it because capitalism just tries to remove meaning from stuff and just sell it as empty product by like signifiers of like toys and merchandise and things like that. Video games make us new, like make a new iteration of it, to like forcing the Neo in that movie to like make a sequel video game series because it's video games in there. And that's what we're seeing with things like Star Trek, Star Wars, like this franchisation of different stories to bigger and greater effect. I think the Star Wars sequel movies are sort of the biggest example of like stripping meaning from franchise for just shallow signifiers of meaning of what the original story would mean. So the movie is about how that stripped meaning and then how that gets co-opted by different groups and how they capitalism essentially gains power by keeping us separated but longing for connection. And by doing that, then it can just sort of force us to constantly work because we're isolated and want to like prove ourselves, and it can extract resources from us or labor from us, quite literally. And the movie then points to like Neo was never the one. He is weak. He is not strong. He's on his own. And it's only when he links up and supports Trinity, someone else, that Trinity can also become the one. And then he can get his power back as well. And everyone else can be the one. So like no one is the one. It's about a collectivist future where we all can become stronger by building each other up and connecting with each other. And it's capitalism trying to keep us apart. That is preventing that from happening. So that's what that movie is trying to say. And ultimately, I feel like the reaction to the movie was very interesting and telling because it got torn apart in reviews. And certainly, there's things you could argue about the movie in terms of some quality level stuff, but like really, people just reacted against that message because it was a message that was countercultural to like what people had sort of ingrained as the message of the Matrix, and saying you cannot be powerful by yourself. You need to connect with others. It's not about you destroying the system. It's about you destroying the system with others. And so it was just the reaction to that film was very telling. And again, I get into this in the video, but it's like Matrix Resurrections like this. A lot of queer movies like I Saw the TV Glow, which I talk about heavily, which is more over, like even more obviously a trans metaphor. The I Saw the TV Glow, the best way I could describe it just very simply is like if Neo was taking the blue pill, like just only took the blue pill. But it's essentially the same story, just that Neo just took the blue pill. And even then people misinterpreted, even though it's so clearly and more overtly a trans metaphor in the Matrix, because ultimately these things get reclaimed or misinterpreted because our culture doesn't teach people the media literacy to do so, because to teach people the media literacy to understand these stories would then mean to teach people to understand differing perspectives than the dominant one. And that's dangerous to the dominant culture.
Yeah. I'm sure everyone would have seen this by now, but there was this trend online at some point in the past few weeks of like Ghiblification, of like this AI thing that OpenAI introduced, like turning scenes from real life and whatever into things that look like Ghibli movies, basically. Yeah. And I thought I would be more angry at that. Okay, I was angry at the trend. The trend was shit, but I was actually weirdly comforted by the fact that this is the best that they can do, in the sense that billions of dollars have been put into ChatGPT and all of that, and this AI industry and whatever. And the closest thing that they have done to what they clearly seem to think is art is a simulacrum of what a bunch of Japanese designers, a lot of whom were doing all of this by hand, managed to do like in the 90s and early 2000s. And they did that later on as well, but like I'm talking Mononoke and Spirited Away and all of those. For me, there's something a bit powerful about that. And I remember when that trend happened, I saw the worst ones. I saw the ICE one, I saw the IDF one, I saw these. And it definitely pissed me off as someone who really loved Ghibli movies. But then I said, okay, I'm gonna just watch a Ghibli movie now. I'm just gonna literally watch one now. And I watched Kiki's Delivery Service, one of my favorite ones. And it reminded me of why, it reminded me of what actually makes a movie like that so powerful. Is that there isn't even a bad guy in the film. It doesn't, and in many of the Ghibli films, it's something that's common. It's like you will have a bad guy, but the bad guy is sort of a misunderstood person, or can be talked to, and maybe there's a redemption arc or whatever it is, or the bad guy is actually the system.
Or is just a function of the world. Yeah.
Exactly, like in Spirited Away or Mononoke in many ways, and so on. And for me, it's like, well, okay, so there are already these stories, and these stories clearly resonate, because why would they spend so much money to do something that's just a simulacrum of it, like just like some aspect of it? If they have this much money, why can't they do something else or something better even? And the answer is that they don't actually believe that it is. They don't actually believe that art exists. They really think it's this technical thing that can be. Brian Merchant calls like AI the aesthetics of fascism. Is very like this thing like the victory of technology over art, right? Because like ultimately they don't actually believe that one needs to quote unquote waste time perfecting small, like in Spirited Away, how they spend so much time just trying to look at how a little girl would put on her shoes, stuff like that, just to perfect that scenes like that. They don't understand why would you waste your time doing that if you can have something that looks close enough, right?
Yeah.
And I find it powerful that I actually do know why, in sense that like that it is something because it's beautiful and people actually enjoy it and it is actually going to live through the generations where these trends are just going to come and go. And this is something that I feel it is something that we already have, we this collective, we and whatever, that is important to remind ourselves because what I've often found, and I'm sure you have as well, and you do talk about it, this kind of doom and gloom. I understand where it comes from. There's no judgment or anything like that, and I certainly go through these periods as well myself, obviously.
Me as well.
It's just that it can't be it. Like it can't be enough. And the question I try not to ask, this is like only within like circle of friends that we trust one another to not be misinterpreted and whatever. And I'll take a bit of a risk with listeners here, but if you are going through kind of this doom and gloom mood or whatever, for very understandable and legitimate reasons, that's not like that's not a question here. It's not a being question. I mean, ask yourself: do you actually know enough people that can contradict this feeling that you're currently, or enough examples rather that can contradict this feeling that you're currently feeling? So for me, it's like I'm feeling very, very down because of something horrible happening or some horrible things that someone has said or whatever it might be. And I try and pause and ask myself, okay, but does that mean that I am downplaying at the same time the good that a lot of people, and I'm kind of being simplistic with like good, bad here, but like the good that many people are doing in the world? Do I have concrete examples in mind other than just this theoretical, like, yes, of course, good people are doing things here? Because this goes back to this whole pollution of the imaginary thing that my mind was already saturated with a certain vision of the world, and it was no longer doing me anything to just have that reiterated time and time and time again. I wasn't learning anything new, even factually, in terms of this facts of a story. It was just reaffirming something that I had already concluded. Like this is the stupidest timeline, and I say this a lot in my head as well. And it can't be this can't be it, right? Like it can't be that stupid. Like I joke, but I also am not joking. I wish we had more interesting enemies. I wish our enemies were more like Sauron, something just more interesting to fight or whatever. We're still living in with the consequences of this elite panic. It's not that it doesn't matter that they don't have like your Elon Musks or whatever, just to use the more obvious one, I guess, don't have much of an imagination. Of course, it matters because they have a lot of resources and power and they affect the world we live in. In that way, it matters. But there is something quite powerful about the fact that they don't seem to actually know what they think the future should actually look like. Like they're
Yes.
very much reproducing it's this whole thing of like reproducing the future is just a replication of the present, basically, right? Like there's just
Yeah.
projection of the present and future, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many things that I wanted to quick touch upon there, but like the first thing you mentioned was like talking about the Ghibli art. It's with the AI stuff. I mentioned this earlier. Like it's they only want to replicate the same story that we've already seen. So like AI,
Exactly.
when the Ghibli, it can only represent. They can only like steal what Ghibli's already done and do a facsimile of it that's not as good. Like it has extra fingers or whatever. And it may look nice on first viewing, but if you look closely, there's no detail orientation in it. There's no humanity in it. It's just the replication of these things over and over and over again, even in the same style. It's like even if you're looking at Ghibli, it's like the same style of character, just sort of standing in the same kind of pose for every single version of whatever they do, just different clothing for like, oh, we did a Star Trek Ghibli one, so they're wearing a uniform with a shitty looking thing, and it's because they see art as what you're talking about, art as product. They just see art as the end goal, not an expression of humanity, of a human person trying to express something that they are feeling and trying to express what they are doing. And like, and so, I'm not necessarily against AI inherently. I mean, I have issues with the ethical things of like they're stealing to scrape for their language models, and also the environmental stuff of like
Of course, yeah,
it
yeah.
costs a bunch, like, so like, but if we removed that, like if it was all the data was sourced ethically and it didn't cost any power to do it, even if we remove that, I'm not necessarily against AI if it was a tool to help people express themselves. But what it is ultimately being sold as right now is not a part of process to enable people to like do something. It is being sold as we can use this to become end product. And it's because
Yeah,
these people who
exactly.
want to use it, they don't reflect, they don't have an interiority that they wish to reflect and sit within. They just wish to regurgitate stuff to get stuff down. And it goes to your end point that you were making of the elite capture of like these people are unable to imagine a future. Like Elon Musk, for example, he loves Star Trek. He wants to create a future where he can make Star Trek, right, with his rockets and SpaceX. But really, he's not replicating Star Trek because he can't really imagine Star Trek. All he can do is sort of this capitalist realism of just replicating his current present. And it's because they don't really want to introspect. They want to hold them. They want to hold themselves at the top of the hierarchy, and they are attacking anyone who is going against their worldview. And as a result, they're not being willing to interrogate themselves, their interiority, question themselves, grow. And yeah, it leads me to this constant conclusion that is, hopeful, even in its kind of darkness, in it, which is, um, humanity will always continually refine its own heart. Like,
Hmm.
as long as one person exists, like even if fascism takes over and destroys and destroys everything, kills everybody, it does all the horrible things. As long as there are two people left in the world and we can form community and talk to each other and communicate and understand ourselves and try to empathize with the other, humanity will continually find its own heart. Again, it's also why I love queerness as a metaphor because
Hmm.
queer people spring up from whatever group, in whatever culture. Like culturally, right now, like we understand queerness and transness is like sexuality based oppression, gender based oppression. But like whatever status quo gets created that tries to ultimately affirm itself, there will be people who fall outside of that and will be queer in some way, marginalized in some way. And as a result of that, there'll be an interrogation and introspection of this conversation between ourselves and the other and who we are, both within the other within ourselves and the other in our society. And people will continually refine these stories, refine these ideas, refine these concepts. What is at risk for me is the history part of it, which is fascism erases history, erases cultures, erases peoples, and there's the human cost of people literally dying, which is horrific, which we
Hmm.
want to stop, and then also just the elimination of our history of like base and this cultural base of different ways we can understand human truths and different ways we can understand what it means to be human through different cultures and different prisms and understand ourselves as a result of that. And so we will refine these things, but what we stand to lose are the people today and also the cultures and rich histories that have existed from time immemorial that get flattened or wholesale erased to fit into a story. And we lose the specificity of those cultural stories and the specificity and the uniqueness of those cultural stories and the ways that the human truths that have already been discovered through those cultures. So
Hmm.
the hopeful part of it is like I believe like humanity will constantly find the truth of its own heart and want to express its heart in some way, shape, or form. Um, how much we will lose, how long it takes to get there, or how many people die, I think is the real urgency. And that's not an incidental thing. It's a very urgent and very real danger that we need to be fighting against because people will die. But there is hope in that, like, I do believe, like, ultimately fascism is a loser's game. Like whoever tries to be a fascist, they're losers. They are losers just as people, they're losers as a system.
Yeah.
The question is just for how long we have to fight the battle.
That's the thing. It's not that the thousand-year Reich lasted 12 years and it was still
Mm-hmm.
catastrophic in those 12 years, obviously.
Exactly. Exactly.
But the fact that it did not last 1,000 years also says a lot about like their own limitations, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you almost paraphrase James Baldwin, which is really good for this podcast. Um, because like he has this clip which I've cited mentioned a bunch of times where like, he said like I may only know four people but that's enough in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that like you can't abandon the world if you know
Mm-hmm.
people who are fighting for the world. Obviously it's a betrayal of them and it's a betrayal of many many
Mm-hmm.
many many people, as he put it. Yeah, I won't get into that because then it'll be like another hour. And
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
me Okay, it's a small parenthesis. Maybe it's not as important, but I do generally wonder when people like Musk and others talk about Star Trek, which ones are they? Like, do they have ones in mind, or is it like an AI interpretation of Ghibli kind of thing? Like, is there a concrete thing that they have in mind that they're thinking of? Is it just basically the original series because that was the big one at the time?
Well, it's the
You see
same
what I
thing
mean?
as
Like,
it's the same thing as
yeah,
the Matrix, right? They've erased the specificity
right,
of it to
yeah,
kind of
that
fit
makes
it into
sense.
their myth. Like there's a Tim Pool. I'm told you I'm working on that Star Trek book, and in that book I'm
Yeah,
mentioning like Tim Pool at one point in one of his podcasts, like I always look to Picard as like this hero of masculinity, and I think what he means, which is funny, but what I think he means is he means like this leader who led a ship of like I'm the guy in charge, and like I make strong speeches that like I know like I can make determinations because I know the ethics. And I think
right.
that that's what he's pulling from without understanding like the specificity of like you go and rewatch the shows. Like Picard is, he's got his faults. He's an isolated man. He doesn't want to
Yeah.
follow being, he doesn't want to have kids around him. And that's kind of an arc
Mm-hmm.
that he goes on. He doesn't, the end of the show
Mm-hmm.
is literally him being like, I should have played poker with you guys before this. Like, there's
Yeah.
a lot more specificity to his character of like, he's not just the guy who does the ethical speeches. And people also forget this. Some of the best episodes of The Next Generation that people usually point to are when Picard is fighting against the system. So, like,
Yeah.
Measure of a Man, when he's fighting for Data's rights against Starfleet, which is trying to dehumanize him. Like those speeches are usually when people fail to live up to Starfleet's ideals because the system does. But like when people like Elon Musk or Tim Pool or whoever like point to Star Trek, they've erased that specificity and are framing it in the ways that like Star Trek can be framed, which is the underlying sort of Western cultural assumptions that are within Star Trek. That it sometimes relies on that like thing of cultural Western progress, of like the technological aspects of like the better future as defined by warp drive, rather than better human future as defined by the humanist ethos of Star Trek. And so like they erase that aspect of it to focus on the technological aspect of it, and that's what they're sort of thinking of. And again, it's why Star Trek's such an interesting tension, because there are moments where it creates something new, and there are moments where it just replicates the present, and it's an interesting tension as a touchstone of sort of I guess a sort of American myth. Um, and the book that I'm writing, just to end on this point, since I'll make this point, like the book that I'm writing is being like that's ultimately the argument is like Star Trek can be read as an American monomyth or a queer monomyth, if you want to look at it in both ways. And what I'm arguing for is to be like we need to create a queer, sort of a queer monomyth is probably the wrong term, but like a queer overriding narrative that we can center, that we can like sort of point people towards like. And I think that's what my other video is arguing too, just to fold it into like a conclusion here of like what I'm basically arguing for is we need to create a narrative for people that's saying this is the narrative that we should follow, and it's a narrative of like understanding others, creating cooperatives and collectives, understanding difference in the infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And what that requires is not pressing cultures all into one norm. So it's an overriding narrative, but it's not one that's trying to say that we need to erase and flatten all the narratives in it. So we need to celebrate this cultural specificity of people and the difference and vibrancy of what it means to be human. Whereas something like Joseph Campbell would sort of say like overriding myth needs to press everything into this mold. And so that's what I'm trying to get people to offer. And it's very difficult, I think, in this time period, especially even an argument. Like there's even contradictions in my own argument, as I say, of like, create an overriding myth of people having different myths. So it's one of those like, that's the beauty though, I think, of humanity, is that like many of these different truths and realities can exist. There's not one truth, there's many. And there's many realities and cultures that exist. And humanity is always going to be a constant engagement with things across difference, where we're going to harm each other, we're going to hurt each other, but we created a culture where harm then is used to create dominance and to push people away. Where I sort of argue like those moments where we hurt each other and harm each other should be moments for engagement, to try to reach out, to try to reflect on why we caused harm and how we can build from there. But we haven't really created a culture of that. So
Yes, I have the sentence in front of me when Cisco talks to the Bajoran prophet and says, like, not to conquer you either with weapons or with ideas, but to coexist and learn. And I actually find it
exactly.
fascinating that they also included with ideas. Like there was also this understanding that this also can be a violent thing.
Hmm.
Okay, Jesse, I can have you on for like 5 hours, but we can't do that. So Well, let's
Yeah,
let's do this.
you said we do it in 50 minutes. We'd have a 50-minute podcast. I'm sure it's longer than that at this point.
It is absolutely longer than that. um, I I wanted to end actually with a comment on that YouTube video, on the one we mentioned, the stories fascism fears most. I found that very moving. Kudos to that 16-year-old who was way more eloquent than I was at that age. But so this is what he says. I'm a 16-year-old homeschooled autistic trans boy living with a conservative religious family. For as many years as I have been outed to them, through complete isolation, self-hatred, and trauma, I've been able to survive because of stories. For so long, fiction has been my only friend, my only hope, my only comfort. It means so much more to me than just entertainment. Without it, I might not be here today. As a writer myself, I've noticed so much of what you explain in this video, of course, talking to you here. Art of all kinds has been so commodified and devalued. It feels like there are very few writing to tell a story that actually means something, writing to expand on the past and project the future they want to see in our world, if it isn't violence or domination, in between parentheses. Storytelling means nothing if you have nothing to say to the world besides what has already been pushed a million times. Writing should reinvent and inspire the world we live in, not glorify the worst parts of it. Jesus Christ. Just very powerful.
I wish I was that articulate, but yeah. Yeah. I
But
mean,
that's like
yeah.
that summarizes the whole the saturation of our imaginaries, the pollution of our imaginaries, the limitations due to capitalist realism, all of the stuff we just talked about. And you have like a 16-year-old trans boy clearly going through like difficulties, also saying that this is quite literally also a matter of survival, and not just survival like as in quite literally to survive difficulties, but also to push beyond them and to move beyond them and so on. And for me, that was like the perfect summary.
Exactly, like what we were talking about. Just don't get caught on the pain. Acknowledge the pain. Know that the pain exists, but like how do we grow? Not ignore it, but how do we grow from it? How do we heal it? How do we carry the scars? And I think that that's ultimately, without getting too wrapped in the weeds of it again, like that's ultimately what a lot of culture wants to do, right? We want to,
Yes.
deny, you look at America, it's like we want to deny that slavery has lasting scars to today. And so those wounds
Yeah.
stay open because no one wants to acknowledge them. We say, oh, it doesn't exist anymore. And it's like, no, we need to acknowledge this harm. We need to grow together and try to help and acknowledge that we were the ones that caused the pain. And so, yeah, it's, I don't know. It's a much larger conversation, and yeah, like hearing stuff like that, it saddens me that he is dealing with that, but it also gives me such hope that there are people who are that young who still see it. Like even
Exactly.
I still get the doomerism of like maybe I'm talking into a void, and gives me
Yeah.
hope that that I'm not. There are people who do hear it. So
Exactly. And as Baldwin said, even if there's only four, it's still worth it.
yeah.
Um, okay. I mean, I feel like this is a good enough and positive note to end on. What are well, you have the book. I was going to ask you like, what are certain things that people should look forward to? What do you want to plug? That sort of thing. So go for it.
Yeah, the big things just that I'm working on right now is I have Subliminal, which will be a series that'll be coming out later on this year. I didn't write it. I'm just directing an episode of it, which I'm very excited about, but just so people know there. But if you are looking for my writing, I am working on a book that is, we don't have an official title for it yet. It's currently on Amazon as like the Star Trek Guide to Gender, I think is what it's currently called. It'll shift at some point, but that'll be coming out sometime next year, and I'll make an official announcement. So those are the two projects. Other than that, just follow me on Jessie Gender. That's where my YouTube stuff is.
Yeah, absolutely. And check out the Nebula account as well. I'm a subscriber there as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, and as I said, I'm fairly soon I'll invite you again to talk about that book.
Yeah, it'll be fun. It's like I said, I'm in the weeds of it right now, so it's
Amazing.
we're still working on it, but it'll be hopefully really good. I'm excited about it. But it touches upon the book is basically what we've been talking about here today, just
Yeah,
focusing on Star Trek as the sort of text to talk about the center of all these conversations. So
amazing. Well, Jesse, thanks a lot for coming.
yeah, thank you for having me.